On this video, I have worked my way up to chapter 29 in the book of Job, and I'm looking at the grammar while reading the text in Job, doing a grammatical analysis, and then a commentary. As we come to these chapters, 29 to 31, the debate between Job and his friends comes to an end. And these chapters is Job speaking, and he gives his past happiness and honor in chapter 29, what his past was like. And then he deals with his present plight in verse 30 and his protest of innocency in 31. And that is sort of the way that these chapters develop in terms of their thought. So we're now in chapter 29. We've tried to work our way through most of the rest of Job prior to this, looking at each word for the most part grammatically, at least every verse, doing some grammar in most of the chapters. And then we have also done the same thing in the speeches of Yahweh in chapters 38 to 42. So we're at this point, and I want to begin with vocabulary and then move on to look at the meaning of the text. So as we begin with vocabulary, we have the word mashal, which means like a proverb or a parable. Mi yatain is an idiom, who will give or grant. Then we have the word a month. Yerach is the word for month. And then we have to shine. Halal. And ner is lamp. Horef is harvest time or autumn. Sod would be like counsel, in where one takes counsel with another. Be'od would be while or yet. Shaddai is a name of God, El Shaddai, for example. Imadi is a poetic way of saying imi, that is, with me. Halif means step, and hema is butter, like curdled milk or butter. Tsuk means to pour out. Imadi, again, poetic for imi, and Peleg is channel, and Keret means town, and Rehov is a broad open place. Moshav is seat. Nechba from chaba to hide. It'll be a nifal stem. Yashish is the aged, the old. Atzar means to restrain or retain. Milah is word. And then we have Nagid, meaning ruler, and Hake, meaning like the roof of one's mouth. These are some of the key vocabulary words, and I find a help to me in just summarizing the vocabulary is the wonderful work, A Reader's Hebrew English Lexicon of the Old Testament, in 4 volumes by Terry A. Armstrong, Douglas L. Busby, and Cyril F. Carr. And some of the vocabulary I just gave was on page 509 of that book. So let me begin looking now at verse by verse and seeing how Job is describing his previous prosperity. And so we begin in verse 1. It reads, Vayosef Iyov Sa'et Meshalo Vayomer. And Job again added, we could say, to lift up or to take up his parable, and he said. So as we look at this verse, and there's just a little bit of the grammar of 29. First of all, we have Yasaf in the first phrase here, Vayosef, from Vayosef, I should say, from Yasaf. It's a peyod verb, and we're looking at a hifil imperfect, third masculine singular from Yasaf. Notice historically it was a pei-vav verb. Yav Sef became Yosef, where the vav and the a coalesced, forming the long holum here, written defectively after the yod. So Job, again, it means to do something again, or to add something. So he lifted up his parable, or he is going to tell a parable or a story. Sa'ed is from the root nasa, a pay noon verb, and the infinitive absolute becomes sa'ed. And so Job again took up his parable, Mashalo Vayomer, and said. Vayomer is the cow imperfect third masculine singular with the vav consecutive or vav conversive. So notice what Job says. Mi yitanenu keyarche kedem. Oh, that he would give me as the months of old. In other words, he wants to go back to the past, to what had happened. And here we have the root natan here. Oh, that he would give me, and the pronominal suffix in the e, yeteneni, with the hinge in the n, connecting us to the e. Oh, that he would give me, or set me. And we have, again, the cow imperfect third masculine singular from Natan. Oh, that he would set me or give me as months of old, as previous months. Yarhe Kedem. And then, as in the days, Kemei Eloah Yishmereni, as in the days when God watched me. And notice Yishmereni is from Shamar, to watch, a cow imperfect third masculine singular from Shamar, followed again by the hinge ain and the e, the pronominal suffix first common singular. So what Job is saying here is Job wishes to go back to the past when God was preserving him from calamities. And he then is going to begin to describe what that past was like. And so we move on to verse 3. Behilu nero ale roshi, when his lamp shine upon my head. A beautiful imagery here of God like shining a lamp upon his head. This is a cow infinitive construct from halal, to shine. And so with a third masculine suffix, pronominal suffix. So we would render it then Oh, that I was in the months, I could be in the months of old, when the days of God watched over me, when his lamp shined, Hilu, upon my head. And then as I walked through the darkness by his light, the oro ele choshek, by his light or to his light, I walked, and I think we could understand be choshek, the preposition be understood here, as I walked in or through the darkness. And notice a lake is from the root halak, cow imperfect, first common singular from halak. And so what Job is wishing is that he could go back to where he was before. And that God's light would shine upon him from halal, as we said. It's a hifil infinitive construct uh, with the preceded by the inseparable bait. When the shining of his light was upon me, I would love to go back to that. Seems to be what Job is saying. And I would love to have that past that I had before when that happened. Let me just say a word about this particular verse as to what I believe Job is saying. He recalls the time when God's favor, as we said, once was shining upon him. And you have similar note in Psalm 18:28. And darkness, he walked through the darkness. God safely led him through dangers. God was his light amid the darkness he confronted. This prevented him from stumbling. And my mind goes back to Psalm 139, a similar idea where it talks about when you walk into the darkness, God will be there, for darkness and light are the same to him. Sort of a similar idea here about how God was with him in the darkness. And then verse 4, Ka asher hayiti bimi horpi, that is, and I was in the days of my youth. He's going back, remembering how his days were in his youth. Hayiti is the cow perfect first common singular from Haya. And then he goes on, Besod Eloah Ale Aholi. That is, when the communion or conversation of God was upon my tent or my dwelling. And so as we look at verse 4, Job seems to be saying, I remember the time. We could say literally in the autumn. It's interesting when we look at the Hebrew noun here, the Hebrew noun horav, it means autumn. You know, when I was in the horpi, my autumn. It's interesting. Life has different seasons. We have the spring, the summer, the autumn, and then the winter. And so Job was still in a good time. And he said, I remember when I had conversation with God, and it was upon my tent. And so this is what we're seeing in verse 4. He refers to the time when his prosperity was at its best, when he was in the autumn of life, depicting the maturity of life, and God was his friend. Job refers to a time when he had an intimate relationship with God. And, you know, as we think about some of the biblical passages that have that same theme. My mind goes to Proverbs 3:32, Psalm 33:20, and John 15, verse 15. And having recalled those earlier times, he now comes to remember how his children were also with him. Notice the next verse, verse 4, or verse 5. Ba'od Shaddai imadi. When, and Ba'od means at the time or when, Shaddai, another name for God, meaning like the mighty one, when Shaddai imadi was with me. And this is just a poetic way of saying imi, when the mighty God was with me, and Sevivotai Neharav, and my children were round about me. And so he's recalling the time when his children were with him. He was raising them. It was a very, can I say, a happy time that he remembers. And then he goes on in the next verse, verse 6. Birchotz alihai bechema. And when my steps were washed in or with butter. What a different imagery here in verse 5 here, speaking of how God had blessed him. And here, birchot is from the root rachatz, meaning to pour out, meaning to wash. So we have a cow infinitive construct in the rachatz preceded by the inseparable bait preposition. So when notice here, my steps, halihai, were washed in butter, vetsur yatsuk imadi palge shaman, and the rock poured out rivers of oil. What a beautiful, beautiful imagery. He looks back over the time again when everything was so wonderful, and to be poured out is from the root suk, from yatsuk, the cow imperfect, third masculine singular, to pour out or to melt. And what he's saying here is, I remember when the Almighty was with me, my children were with me, my steps were poured out or washed in butter, and the rock poured out with me, or with me, unto me, with me, rivers of oil. Again, the cow imperfect, third masculine singular from suk. What's interesting here is the imagery that he's using is showing the serenity of life that he was experiencing in the past. All his adventures brought the richest milk and oil to him. These are symbols of prosperity used here. We find them, for example, in chapter 32, verse 13. And olives are produced among rocks, and they produce the best oil for food, for lamps, for anointing, for medicine. And so this is what Job is describing as he's recalling his past and how God provided him not only with his children, but his steps were washed like with butter, with a lot of prosperity. And the rock poured out oil, rivers of oil, probably looking here at the olive oil that grew among the rocks. and produce the best kind of oil for food, for lamps, and so forth. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to try to hold these to about 20 minutes. I think I go too long sometimes. And so in verses 7 to 10, we'll see how Job also had great influence over those he lived with, both young and old, and how he would sit in the entrance of the city where legal and business transactions were made. He would decide cases there, and he was esteemed by the community. So we're looking at what he had in the past versus in the next chapter where he's at now. And as I read this, I thought about life, how we all have these experiences where we go through life and everything seems to be such a wonderful thing. And then there's a season of life that's very different. And whether we're going through illness or financial stress or just growing older, uh, I find that to be very challenging to me, the whole idea of aging. And so I read a text like this, I can identify with Job. And I think maybe many of you will be able to identify with him too, wherever you are in life, whether you're in the winter of life, the autumn, or the summer. Everybody has times where they remember the past, and what God has done in the past seems different from what's happening in the present. So I'm going to stop here and we'll continue on next time.